If you stopped exercising, if you stopped using your muscles, they would atrophy. And so, what the creators of this building believed is that if you live in an environment that is just a gray box,
same old.
your senses and the connections between your senses and your brain start to atrophy. They start to kind of die off because you're not using them, you're not stimulating them. And they believe that is what promotes aging. So they wanted to, in many ways, shake it up, they sort of stir up the senses. And what I find really interesting about this is it sounds so wild, but there's now research in animals, and it's only in animals right now, that shows that an enriched environment, a sensorially stimulating environment, can help forestall dementia.
So today's guest is a woman who is absolutely incredibly talented. She is a designer and an author. And what I love about her work is that she emphasizes beauty through simplicity. And that just speaks to my heart. So rather than me tell you more about her, let Ingrid Fetell Lee share with you her story. So thank you so much, Ingrid, for coming on today.
So happy to be with you.
Thank you. So we were just talking before we started, and Ingrid and I are both New Yorkers. So, when you get two New Yorkers in the room, it's like, do you know this? Do you know that? Do you know the other thing? And I went to NYU, and I see you went to the School of Visual Arts in New York City.
No, I taught at the School of Visual Arts. I went to Princeton. I went to Princeton, and then I did my graduate work at Pratt.
Great. Okay, so you're a Tiger then.
I am.
Princeton
yeah,
Tiger,
through and
right?
through.
There you go. Okay. So, have you always been passionate about finding beautiful things and just making anything beautiful? Like, how did that happen for you, especially coming from Princeton?
I think I always had an attraction to beautiful things, but I didn't know that design was a career that you could have. My parents were both doctors. I thought that MDs, and I thought when you grow up, you go to law school or you go to medical school, or I don't know what else, like what other options there were. There really was just medical school. It's an option when I was little. Yeah. So you could be a scientist, right? I didn't know that design was a thing you could do. And yet my grandmother was a very aesthetic and a person who was very sensitive to beauty. And so from a very young age, I had this exposure to someone who was incredibly crafty, who made a lot of things with her hands, who actually had taught herself to refinish furniture,
was this on your maternal side or was this on your mom's side or your dad's side?
My mother's mother.
Okay, I just find it interesting.
And so I spent a lot of time with her growing up, and I think I absorbed a lot of that. And but it wasn't until I got to design school, which was graduate school.
Well, hang on a second, though, Ingrid. So hang on a second, especially because I know the background that you're from, like that Westchester, like you grow up in these, your parents paid like $1 gazillion in real estate tax because it was the best schools in the country. So you could go to one of the best schools of the country, i.e. Princeton, right? Okay, so far I'm following the story. So what was your undergraduate major, and how did design graduate school happen? Because I could see two positions being like, you want to do what?
It was not a linear path. I studied English creative writing at Princeton, and I thought I was going to be a novelist. So at that point, I think I had managed to convince them that I was not cut out for medical school, that was not going to be my path. I remember when I was visiting colleges, my dad would just subtly pick up the pre-med brochures in every one of the college offices. And I had managed to convince him that was not in the cards. Although I loved science. I always have. I loved biology. I loved psychology. And it's actually come in very handy that I have an interest in those things. But I wanted to write. And I thought it was fiction that I was going to write. And then I wrote a novel for my undergraduate thesis. And then I thought,
You did a whole novel?
A novel, never published. And I thought, well, I think I need some real world experience before I go try to write another novel. It felt very naive. Like I just didn't know enough about the world to write. And so I thought, okay, well, let me go
that
do
was a
something.
lot of wisdom. That was a lot of wisdom, though, to know that at your stage, right? Most people at 21, I went to Ivy League. Okay, I'm ready to set the world on fire. Like the accountants, not the accountants, the consultants, like when they get hired and they go, I'm like, what do you know? You don't know anything about life.
Right. I think you do. I probably had that in other ways, but I think I knew the experience of trying to write a novel at 20 was humbling. So I took that experience and I went off and did something very opposite. I started out in market research. So I was doing quantitative market research for magazine covers, and I was testing every month magazines like Vogue and Gourmet, Lucky magazine, which no longer exists.
Like data analytics of the covers, like that?
Yeah, actually trying to understand what image, what cover lines, which order you should put the cover lines in, which ones should be big, which ones should be small, all of that to figure out which would help each issue sell the best. And it was a very interesting sort of slice of human nature. I learned a lot about understanding behaviors and what people say, but what they actually do. So from there, I spent 2 years doing that. And then I decided that I wanted to do something a little bit more creative. So I moved into brand consulting. So I moved to a company called Landor. I decided to move to Australia to see a little bit more of the world. My grandmother was Australian. So I thought, let me go see what that's like. And I moved into brand consulting. And it was when I was in that role that I was doing a lot of this more observational research.
I do have a question for you.
Sure.
So two things. Was the grandmother that was in Australia, was she the creative grandmother?
Yes.
The same one?
Same one.
Okay. So I'm trying to get the timeline right. I would have thought someone that wanted to do brand consulting at the time, those opportunities would have been as a New Yorker, the center of the University of New York. Were there opportunities to do that in Australia?
There are opportunities to do brand consulting anywhere. I mean,
really? Okay.
I just happened to want to live in Australia. And so I decided that was going to be where I was going to make my next move. And actually, it's an interesting point because it's a much smaller pool. And a lot of what you're doing is working with more local brands. But that meant that I was able to take on a huge amount of responsibility very young. And so I remember being handed my first project and I'm like, wait, I'm going to lead this. And I've really never done brand consulting before. And I have no idea what I'm doing. And you're just going to send me out there to do this. And I had this great mentor who just really had a ton of confidence in me. And he sort of saw that there was something in this weird creative writing meets market research background that actually was the perfect fit for that work. So I started doing that. And then I started finding that I was always really drawn to what was happening over on the design side of the studio. It was a big open plan studio and the designers were over here and then us brand consultants and then the finished art and then the production. And I was always just kind of curious about what was going on over there. And I spent a lot of time collaborating with designers. And I thought, God, I would really love to be able to make things in the world, to have an idea and be able to make it tangible. That seems amazing. And so I started investigating design and I realized that there are actually so many different kinds of design, right? There's graphic design, which is who I was mostly working with, people who deal with packaging and labels and signage and visuals and printed materials, web. Web was still really early in those days. Interaction design, it became this discipline of, or we call UI and UX design, designing the front end and back end experiences that we deal with online. Architecture is a form of design, fashion design. And then there was this thing in the middle, industrial design, or sometimes called product design. And that's kind of like everything else. So it's not as big as a house, and it's not the clothes you put on your body, but it's like everything else that gets made in the world. Your car, your table, your cups, your saucers, your pens and pencils, your electronics, all of that is lumped into this one field, industrial design. And I thought, this is so interesting, because then I can have any idea that I want and I can figure out how to get it made in the world. That was what was so fascinating to me. And so I came back. I spent some time working at another consultancy doing more observational research.
Wait, when you say came back, you mean came back to the States?
I came back to the States, yeah.
So how long were you in Australia for?
2 years. And then
And
I traveled for 6 months after that.
Not working.
Not working.
And then why did you decide to come back to the States? Was it personal? Was it business?
A mix. I felt like I was ready. I wanted to go to graduate school, and the graduate schools I wanted to go to were either in the US or the UK. So I was looking at those schools, and I thought I would take some time to work a little bit more and work on my application for graduate school. I mean, I really didn't. Not that I didn't know how to draw. Everyone kind of knows how to draw, but I didn't know how to draw for design. I didn't know how to create things, and I had to submit a portfolio to get accepted to school. And I thought, how am I going to do this? So I spent some time back at my dad's house working on my portfolio. I just came up with some product ideas and started making them. We made a lot of trips to Home Depot, and I started trying to build these rough prototypes of my ideas and photograph them and put them together in a portfolio. And I didn't expect to get in the first round. So I was actually really excited when I did get in, and I was able to go to grad school and start that.
Which was where? Of my journey. And where was that?
At Pratt.
Where was Brooklyn. That? At Pratt. Okay. No, yeah. I just want people to hear it.
So it was at Pratt that I think, you asked this question of, have I always been drawn to beauty? I realized I had always been drawn to beauty, but I didn't really understand it. And it's a funny coincidence that I ended up picking Pratt. In retrospect, it was not the school that was my top choice. I had other schools that I thought would probably be a better fit, but for life reasons, I made the choice to stay in New York and go to Pratt. And it turns out that Pratt is an extremely aesthetics-focused school. So unlike a lot of the other programs, which are very focused on mechanics and structure and mass production and engineering and all of these other aspects, Pratt has a really long history of being influenced by sculpture and being influenced by artists, people who brought a sense of craft to the idea of beauty. That beauty isn't something you luck into, but beauty is actually something that you can really understand and you can really craft and create. And so that's what I learned at Pratt. And I was very skeptical.
So hang on a second. So Ingrid, you said, and this is from my ignorance, you said you didn't really understand art. What is there to understand? Meaning, if it's something visual and you love it, it touches your soul and your heart. So tell me more about that. It totally speaks to my ignorance, the question, but you're so passionate about it. And I'm like, wait, you have to understand art? Like, so please.
So I'm not saying you have to understand art, and I'm not saying that there's appreciating and experiencing beauty, and then there's the desire to create it. Okay. And I think once you have a desire to create it, there are certain tools that can help you be more effective. And I'm sure many people have had this experience. Maybe you've had this experience where you have an idea of how you want something to be. You see a photo, or you get an inspiration, or you visit a hotel somewhere and you think, God, I love the way that these colors go together. Or I love the way that photograph is composed. And then you try to do it for yourself and something's not right. It's not the same.
That happens all the time.
Right. And so, it's not that you have to understand this to appreciate beautiful things in the world. You absolutely don't. But when you get to the point where you want to start creating things, there's an intuition that we all have inside around what's beautiful to us, what feels good to us, what would bring us joy. And then there's certain skills that we need to be able to go out and create that. And I think that's what I learned at Pratt was deep. For example, I didn't know that you could take 2 whole semesters of color theory, not like color psychology, like what happens in the brain when you see color, but actually the theory of how colors influence each other and how to use them and how to put them together so that they feel a certain way. How do you create an atmosphere through color? How do you create a mood or a feeling? All of that comes from, very small adjustments in how much black is in the color, how much white is in the color, how close together these colors are, how far apart they are, and the tensions they create. And of course, there are artists throughout the years who have only focused on that, right? There's like Joseph Albers, who is only focused on how colors relate to each other and the interesting things that happen when you put certain colors next to each other. So getting to study that, and that's just one dimension. Color is just one dimension. There's also form, there's line, there's plane, there's 3-dimensional form. There's so many aspects to why something feels balanced, why something feels off balance. There are so many elements, and I didn't know that any of those things were there. And so I think you can think of it as you have ambitions in the world, and then you have what you're able to achieve. And when you get to the point where your ambitions just constantly feel beyond your ability, then it's time to start looking at like, what are the skills that I can acquire that will help my abilities catch up to my ambitions? They'll never really catch up. For a lot of us, we always will have ambitions that are beyond our abilities. But I think that's what I'm saying when I didn't know that there was a place you could go to study all of that and learn all of that.
So when you did learn that, is that what you learned at Pratt? Or then once you're at Pratt and this new awareness opens up, was there more to learn?
Well, that's what I learned at Pratt. And what was really interesting when I was there, I was having a review, my first year-end review. And it's this very stressful endeavor where you lay out everything you created over the course of the year. And a bunch of professors stand in front of you in a panel, and they're very quiet and they look at your work, and then they just start to talk. And one of the professors said, "Your work gives me a feeling of joy." And I thought, well, that's weird. I always thought of joy as this very ephemeral, fleeting feeling, not something that you can see or touch. And so that's a different lens on it.
That was a compliment though, right?
It was certainly a compliment, but it was something that I didn't know what to do with. I actually came into grad school really interested in sustainability. I thought I wanted to create eco-friendly products. That was my goal. I land in this school that's extremely beauty focused. And I start to realize that, I've actually been interested in this my whole life, but I didn't know there was such a thing. And I probably would have thought that it was maybe a little shallow, a little superficial, not something that I should be focusing my time on. When the professor said this thing about joy, I thought, well, that's really interesting, because what you're saying is that this thing, this object, whatever thing we're looking at can evoke an emotion in you, and it can evoke an emotion in multiple people, and multiple people can look at something and agree that it gives them that particular emotion. How does it do that? And that was something that none of the professors could answer. So I went to the library looking for a book on it. No book. There were books on emotional design, but there was no science in them. It was all just intuitive and sort of hand.
So now the daughter of the doctors is coming out.
Exactly. And so at that point, I thought, okay, well, this is an interesting puzzle. I'm very curious about the beauty piece of it and why these things are so beautiful. I have a better understanding now of the tools that can do that. But how does it create this feeling? And I started to think, if we could intentionally design things that brought joy scientifically, then wouldn't that be a cool thing to be able to do? And as I started to understand joy and the way that joy influences us, I thought it's not just about, making people happy. It's not like the Prozac of design. Like, that's not really what it's about. It's about the fact that, joy improves our productivity, it improves our creativity. It, connects us more deeply to each other. By creating things that bring joy, we could actually design a world that felt more nurturing, more supportive. It could help us thrive. And so I thought, okay, well, this is really interesting. Now I'm interested in this problem. And so I started going out and asking people about the things and places that brought them joy. And I found that there were certain things that just kept coming up again and again and again. There were things like bubbles and balloons and tree houses. Excuse me. I'm going to take a sip of water.
Yeah.
Rainbows and rainbow sprinkles, googly eyes, I don't know if I mentioned tree houses.
You did men and women, boys and girls, right?
I just literally talked to everyone that I encountered on the street. I took a clipboard out into Times Square and just started asking people. And I noticed that these things, there are obviously certain things that are very personal that bring us joy, but there were these specific things that kept coming up again and again and again. And so
universal.
They were universally joyful. So that was the first interesting foundational element for my work, which is that there are certain things that bring joy the world over. And knowing that, I think, though they seem kind of trivial, like what do rainbow sprinkles really matter in the world? But they tell us something really important, that there's something within all of us that is drawn to the same things, that there's some common thing deeper than our individual differences. So that was really powerful to me.
So what was that? What does it tell us? I totally agree with you. So what is it telling us?
Well, from a scientific perspective, actually, let me take a step back. So I was wondering what that told us. And so I started printing out pictures of all of the things that people mentioned. And I put them up on my studio wall and I looked at them and I would just rearrange them every day. I would come into my studio and I would rearrange them and try to spot commonalities. And one day it was like something just clicked. I had my beautiful mind moment and I started to see patterns, that there were certain common threads to these sets of images. So for example, round shapes. Round shapes we find in joyful things the world over. Bubbles, balloons, balls, Ferris wheels, merry-go-rounds. So many of the things that bring us joy, polka dots, are round, or a sense of abundance and multiplicity. So rainbows, many colors together, patterns, stripes, this repetition of many elements. So abundance, or just think of, being a kid in a candy store. It's like there's just so much and you just have this joyful stimulation.
Is it all the different colors in the candy store too? Is that part of it?
Colors is a big part of it. But it's color, texture, it's sensation. It's the abundance of sensation, a positive sensation. Another one is obviously color, bright color, and light. Bright, warm, sunny days, bright light, that's very joyful. Whereas darkness tends to be, when things are in shadow, they tend to make us feel more somber or more anxious. So noticing these patterns altogether, I identified 10 of them and I started calling them the aesthetics of joy, which really just means the sensations of joy. Aesthetics is a very loaded word, but actually its root it comes from the Greek aesthenome, which means I feel, I sense, I perceive. So knowing that, I realized that these patterns were all related to, they could all be traced to things in our environment that would have been beneficial to our ancestors, would have been beneficial to their survival. So if you imagine, I don't know, 80,000 years ago, out on the savannah, early humans walking around, there are certain things that would be beneficial to them. Bright color usually would be a sign of nourishment. Usually it would be a sign of an environment that can support or sustain life. A pop of bright color.
But you're talking about, we know that now. They didn't know that then.
No, it's okay. Not, our response to these things being universal is unconscious. So it's not that we think, oh, bright color, that's nourishment, that's good for me. Mm-hmm. It's, I respond to bright color, I'm drawn to bright color. And the reason is that 80,000 years ago, bright color might be the difference between life and death for one of my ancestors. Mm-hmm. And so color, round shapes, it makes perfect sense why round shapes are more joyful than sharp angles, because sharp angles could be dangerous to us. So for each of these aesthetics, there's an evolutionary rationale for why we are drawn to those things. That's what makes them universal. And that's why they're so interesting to me, because they're connected to our thriving.
So this is a hard question. Why do you think nobody else knew that? This was these professors' life's work. If someone is touching our heart, right, and it's a classic, I guess I'm wondering why nobody else wanted to know why or how to find a way to incorporate it into the teachings of it.
I think there are a couple of reasons. One has to do with the way that our educational system works. We are very
we could go on all day about that, right?
Tightly segmented into disciplines, right? And so design is traditionally the province of art schools. It's not really, there's not a lot of crossover between design and science or psychology. So that's one reason.
Really?
No.
How could you? I can't imagine you can divorce psychology from art, because somebody, I'll say, throws a can of paint on the wall and it's brilliant. And I walk by and I'm like, oh, my kids did that when they were 3. So there's a psychology there, right? Our perception of beauty, our perception of art.
Sure. I'm not talking about, I'm sure there are people who study the psychology of art that's very different than studying the psychology of design. Art and design are very different, right? And there is not a lot. So in the applied world of design, there isn't a ton of crossover between. So there are people who study the psychology of art. And I will say there's not a lot of crossover between the people who study the psychology of art and the people who are teaching how to make art. That those disciplines are often very siloed, not just in different departments, but in different schools, different institutions, because art is typically taught in art schools.
I understand? I totally get what you're saying. And as the professional here, would you think that there would be a benefit to it, or am I just don't understand the nuances?
I mean, my whole body of work is that there is a benefit to it. It's just that that's not how it's organized. So you asked why it hasn't been done before. I'm trying to explain why it hasn't been done before. Right. That's one reason. Right. Another reason is that we have a kind of mind-body divide.
Sure.
And I think that design falls into this realm of the applied, the practical, it's for mass production, it's for consumption, it's a discipline about creating things that go out into the world, whereas science is sort of the contemplation of the mind. Scientists are often very hesitant about having their conclusions put to use by designers, and often the reason is that scientists know that science changes. It's not like we discover this thing and it's fact and it's law. It's might not replicate, or it's true in this population, but not in the whole world. So there are a lot of things that make scientists wary about saying, now we should go build a world based on our findings. There's a lot of ambivalence there. And so I think sometimes that is a reason why it doesn't doesn't translate. And I think the people who go into design often have different skill sets than the people who go into the sciences.
Sure.
So there are, what I found in my research, it's interesting as an independent researcher, my work is not, I'm not a scientist in a lab. I'm someone who interprets studies from many, many different disciplines, even from different disciplines in the sciences that aren't always talking to each other. So I'm looking at affective science, the science of emotion. I'm looking at positive psychology, the new discipline of positive emotions and thriving, and why we spend so much time focusing on negative emotions when actually there's a lot of upside that has never even been considered. I look at neuroscience. I look at environmental psychology, which a lot of environmental psychology actually focuses on nature. There's actually very little about the interior home environment. There's some on the work environment, but very little on the home environment. So anthropology, there's a lot of different disciplines. So my work is really an active synthesis across many different disciplines to try to understand what do the different findings that scientists are making in very disparate corners of the world mean for our relationship to the physical world.
Wow. So what part of everything you just said speaks to you? Like what is the most pertinent for what brings you joy in your work?
I mean, all of it. I don't have like a specific part. I think I'm motivated by questions. I'm motivated by trying to find answers. And so for me, I was
what types
originally
of questions?
interested
Answers
in
to
that.
What?
So originally my question was, how is it possible that something out in the world can bring us joy?
Mm-hmm.
How does that work? And, many of us have been taught that joy comes from within, that it's that it's an internal thing. So right. I think there's also a resistance to studying that, to connecting it to external things. There's a almost philosophical opposition to that. And so
is it mutually exclusive?
No, of course not. And I would say, what I would say is that I think the whole internal external divide is just, it's a fiction. Artificial. Our senses are constantly taking in information from our surroundings, being processed by our brains, which is causing us to act and do things. There is no thinking without sensing. Right. It doesn't make sense. And so to me, that dialogue is, it's a constant one. And so there is no external or internal. It's just that
it just is.
It's just that the external things have been given short shrift in both the sciences, in the sciences, I think, for a long time. And so for me, the question of this, it was like unexplored territory. And that's always just so fascinating when you get to go into a space that no one has explored really. And stake it out.
So for sure, there's no doubt. I'm hearing so much of the scientist in you, even though you're fighting it. You were fighting it every step of the way. Tell me about a connection, a fascination, a truth, whatever word you want to use, from your learnings of neuroscience and connecting that to joy and aesthetics in your work. Because I love neuroscience. I dabble in it, shall we say. But I think, I love neuroscience because on some level, it proves like the soft skills. You know what I mean? Like it's not
sure.
Yeah.
So when I first started studying these things, right, I started at the level of what are things that we're drawn to. Okay, there are certain things that we're universally drawn to. Okay, there are certain sensations that we're universally drawn to. Not just balloons and bubbles and balls, but we're drawn to circles and spheres, curves. Okay, why would we be drawn to curves? And neuroscience is helpful at illustrating, first of all, that the association is really universal because we can look inside the brain and see how it's responding. And then we can start to use that to influence our why, our interpretation of the why. So one example, neuroscientists place people into fMRI machines and they show them pictures of angular objects and round ones. And gosh, I would love if there were like 100 more studies like this with every other different kind of thing that you could give people smooth things and rough things, give people symmetrical environments and asymmetrical environments, just all of the different things I study. I would love to just have a whole stack of neuroscience studies like this.
Maybe AI will come up with it for you. So hang on.
Maybe. But in the meantime, there is this one study of angles versus curves. And what the researchers found is that a part of the brain called the amygdala, so they're always studying the amygdala, right? This part of the brain associated with fear and anxiety, and in particular with unconscious fear. So this is before you're consciously aware of it. It's just how something in your brain is responding to
a threat.
Something in your surroundings as a threat. And when we see angles, that part of the brain lights up. And when we see round shapes, that part of the brain stays quiet. Now they're showing people like a sofa, like a sofa with a square edge versus a sofa with a curve. It's not like they're showing them a knife and a ball. They're showing just an angled object and a round one. And so to me, that's pretty profound, because it's saying that if you are surrounding yourself with sharp angled things, there is this little level of agitation that's happening in your unconscious mind. And we know that the way that the brain works is we don't have a thing that we're worrying about and then get anxious. And then that's one way that it can go, is we have something we're worried about and we get anxious. But often what actually happens is we feel agitated. And then the brain goes, what am I agitated about? Why is my body feeling agitated? Let me find a reason. And then we look for the most proximate reason. Well, I must be worried about X. And so then kicks off a loop of rumination and worry. But we may have missed the actual reason that we are so agitated. And so to me, if the environment can have that effect on us.
What you just said about the angle and the curve, I mean, that's the whole concept of feng shui, right? You come in and is it feng shui a room?
Feng shui definitely has an aspect that is about curves and angles. And it's very interesting to me because that's an intuitive, ancient Chinese practice. And here is neuroscience affirming the value of that in the present.
Oh, yeah. You know what? There's a lot of ancient wisdom that was lost that we're bringing back. Thank God.
It's true.
Interesting. That's so interesting. All right. So tell us, I'm so aware of the time. I could keep you on all day. So tell us about your book, because I feel like you just gave us a glimpse into it. And I just love everything about it. So unabashedly promote it.
Well, Joyful is the story of these 10 aesthetics and my discovery of these 10 aesthetics of joy. And so I think a lot of people might say, well, I'm not into bright color. I don't want to paint my house yellow, and I would say that makes perfect sense. Instead, let's look at any of the other 9 aesthetics of joy that you might apply in your home. And so what I tried to do in Joyful was weave together some of this science with my own explorations of places out in the world that were bringing these aesthetics to bear in improving people's lives. So some of it is the story of my adventures. I go to Japan to an apartment building that was designed to reverse aging. I go to Iceland to look for elves because there's a large percentage of the Icelandic population that believes in elves. So I went looking for magic and the magic aesthetic. Travel to,
Excuse me, let me ask you about the reversing age, because I did hear about that building. So everybody is into longevity today. So please share your wisdom here.
Okay, so this was a building designed it's outside of Tokyo, and it was designed by an artist and a poet couple who believed that architecture could reverse aging. It's full of bright colors. The floors slope, so it's not level. You actually have to kind of hold on to poles around the room to navigate. But the it's wild. It's not an easy place to live. But here's where they were coming from.
It keeps you on your toes. It keeps you young, I guess.
So the belief was that, imagine, if you stopped exercising, if you stopped using your muscles, they would atrophy. And so what the creators of this building, Arakawa and Gins, believed is that if you live in an environment that is just a gray box,
same old. Mm-hmm.
Your senses and the connections between your senses and your brain start to atrophy. They start to kind of die off because you're not using them. You're not stimulating them. And they believe that is what promotes aging. So they wanted to, in many ways, shake it up, the sort of stir up the senses. And what I find really interesting about this is it sounds so wild, but there's now research in animals, and it's only in animals right now, that shows that an enriched environment, a sensorially stimulating environment, can help forestall dementia. And so I think what's interesting to me about this is a lot of us live in these very minimalist environments, or we work in environments that are gray and beige and cubicles and just rows of sameness. And there's a provocation here, which basically says, is that actually the best thing for our mental health and well-being? Now, we know from studies done in work environments that when people work in lean work environments, those sort of strip bare environments, or when they work in enriched work environments, which have art and plants, they're 15% more productive in the enriched environments. If they have some control over the stuff in their space and they can move it around the way they like it, choose the art, choose the plants, they're 32% more productive than in the lean work environment. So there's lots of research to suggest that bringing more stimulation into our environment, whether or not it prevents aging, can actually be beneficial to us. It can make us more productive. It can make us more content at work, and can just, I think, ease some of this low-level agitation that we might think is coming from overstimulation, but is actually a form of understimulation.
So interesting. So I do want to ask you this one question, and then I want you to let people know how they can get your book and learn more about you. What is the last book you reread and why?
This book I reread and why? That is a great question. I don't do a lot of rereading lately. I mean, I have to say, I have a toddler and there's so few hours in the day that most of my time is reading, not rereading.
An ebook, a podcast, or
that what?
That you re-listen to.
I re-listen to. Gosh.
Or what about this then? What about something that you've gone back to reference on more than one occasion, and why?
I'm looking around because generally things that I'm going to reference multiple times I have handy, but I just did declutter my office. So now it's very sparse. One thing that I've been re-referencing a lot, actually, what's it called? It's called Laziness Does Not Exist by Devin Price. Do you know that book?
No, I don't, but I can see why you would like it. I don't associate the word lazy with you at all.
Great book. The premise of the book is that laziness is effectively a capitalist construct, that generally the signs of our body, when we feel what we often interpret as laziness, usually what we're actually feeling is exhaustion. And that we are taught to override our body's signals of needing rest because we have been conditioned to believe that our worth is connected to our work,
productivity,
our output, and that if we are not productive all the time, that we are lazy, and that lazy is a morally bad thing to be, and a dangerous thing to be, because if we actually rest, we might never start working again. this book, I think, really reframed, it helped me articulate something really important about joy, which is that many of us have been raised to see joy as conditional, as a reward for good behavior, as something we earn. And it's baked into us from a very young age in things like you have to eat what's on your plate before you get dessert. And you have to
exactly
earn
what
your
I thought
dessert.
as you said it. Yeah.
Which, the current teachings on food and kids is like completely different, that you serve the dessert with the meal and you don't make it conditional. There's no conditions on getting the dessert, that you serve a small portion, whatever would be the appropriate portion with the food, and they get it whether or not they eat the meatballs. Doesn't matter, or the Brussels sprouts. It doesn't matter. You're not making it conditional. And this was just such a powerful shift for me because it explained why we often feel unentitled to joy, even when we have worked 100-hour weeks, right? We never feel like we've earned it. The reality is you don't have to earn it. You're worthy of it regardless of whether you earned it, because it's not a reward. It's an innate human attribute that is evolved into us to help us understand when we're thriving and to help guide us toward things that will help us thrive. And so if we understand joy that way, then we know that joy is not a reward. It's a means to an end. It's a means to help us thrive. So by finding the things that bring us joy, we are not wasting time. It's not a distraction. It's not being frivolous. It's actually putting us on the path toward greater self-discovery, self-actualization, greater connection with other people, purpose in our work. All of those things, joy can be a conduit to, as opposed to an outcome of.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love it. I love it. Okay, so tell people how they can find out more about you, if they want to connect with you, if they want to find more joy in their life, and where you'd like them to go to get your book.
Yes. Okay. So Joyful, my book, is available anywhere books are sold. I always love to point you toward your nearest independent bookstore, but you can find it anywhere in hardcover, paperback, ebook, and audio. A lot of artists I know like to listen to the audio while they paint or create.
Entrepreneurs, most entrepreneurs too.
Yes. Also, please visit us at schoolofjoy.co. That's where you can find out about our workshops, both for home and for finding more joy in work. And I am on Instagram at Ingrid Fetell, so you can find me there.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I feel like your message should be sung from the mountaintops. I think you also radiate joy. I feel it from you.
Thank you.
But I think there's so much noise and angst in the world. And if, everybody just had a little bit of more joy in their life, what a much more peaceful, happy, joyful world this would be. So thank you. Thank you so much, Ingrid.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for having me.